It was the sort of Oxford morning that arrives not with drama, but with the gentle insistence of damp wool and dripping stone. The air hung close to the cobblestones, thick with the quiet, ecclesiastical dampness that seeps into your collar and stays there. I had taken Turl Street by instinct, rather than direction, though I suspect now that instinct has its own designs we're rarely meant to understand. I paused beneath the awning of an old tailor's shop, its striped canvas giving a periodic twitch each time a bead of water grew too fat to cling. Somewhere above, a gutter cleared its throat. The cold smelt of ink and fireplaces, a narrow shop front to my left, one I must have passed 100 times without ever really seeing, offered a dull golden glow through its rain-speckled windows. A coffee shop. The Roasted Bean, its sign said in serif type that tried too hard not to. I stepped inside, partly for warmth, partly for some memory I couldn't quite name. The bell above the door gave the sort of sound that makes you think of French train stations and unclaimed suitcases. Inside it was quiet, but not still. The sort of quiet that suggests something has just finished happening. Not a soul in sight, and yet the espresso machine murmured faintly to itself, its pipes twitching like a creature still digesting. A Bach partita hung low in the air, stitched faintly with the hiss of steaming milk. A ceramic cup sat waiting at the far end of the counter, half full, unsipped, as if someone had left in haste or been interrupted mid-thought. And yet the coffee was fresh. Not an hour old, not even 10 minutes. I could smell it, that unmistakable mingling of ground Arabica and the scorched sweetness of foam, pulled too tightly. Someone had made it recently. Very recently. The counter was empty, no shoes visible behind it, no coat on the hook, a scattering of receipts beside the till, the kind one doesn't leave without intent. What struck me, though, was the frame above the espresso machine. A single line, printed in dark ink on cream paper, in what might have once been a tasteful frame, but now looked a touch too self-aware. In my end is my espresso. I stood there longer than I should have. Not because of the coffee, though it was oddly quite good, but because the line was wrong. I knew the original well. In my end is my beginning. Eliot, from East Coker, though he was borrowing it, I believe, from Mary, Queen of Scots. Either way, this was no poetic flourish. It was a misquotation, and not a careless one. There's a difference. I took a seat near the window, more to watch the street than the room, though even as I did so, I found myself watching the room more than the street. The rain had begun again, finer now, like silk threads on glass. A student walked past, hood drawn, a satchel clutched against his ribs like an overdue manuscript. Across the road, the lights in the rare bookshop flickered into amber life. I wondered briefly who Felix Hargrave was. Not just in the obvious sense, but in the sense that matters, the kind of man who quotes Eliot but gets it wrong, who leaves coffee steaming and music playing and vanishes between the beats of a partita. It was Lewis, of course, who would bring the news the next morning, with the air of a man certain he's delivering a footnote to a dull event. Natural causes, he would say, or possibly not. The word anonymous would be used, but in that moment, with Bach settling around me and rain tattooing the windows, all I knew was this: someone had gone missing too deliberately, and the coffee was fresh, and the owner wasn't. It was one of those mornings when the Bodleian felt more like a mausoleum than a library, heavy with the breath of old paper and unsaid things. I had found my way to the top reading room by means neither practical nor entirely conscious. A worn copy of Henry Vaughan, collected verse and visions opened before me like a quiet confession. There is something about metaphysical poets that appeals when the world has become just slightly off-key. They believed too much, perhaps, but at least they believed in something. The footsteps behind me were not subtle. Lewis has a way of announcing himself even in silence, as though the soles of his shoes carry their own internal monologue. He hovered a moment too long before speaking, the way he does when he's not quite sure whether the news he bears is worth disrupting a thought. Felix Hargrave, he said, had been found dead. Hot, most likely, though they were still waiting on someone in a white coat to say so with conviction. Behind the counter, late last night, cleaner saw the lights on. Couldn't get a reply. Called it in. He paused. Then, though he didn't need to, I was already frowning. The espresso had been warm when I stepped inside. Not warm in the abstract way a room holds heat, but warm in the intimate, unmistakable way of something recently made and intended. The lights hadn't flickered with age. They had glowed, deliberate and recent, like candles just lit. And the music. That had been what struck me most. The Bach Parterre hadn't been playing for long. It was on the second movement when I walked in. I remembered, because the phrasing had a kind of thoughtful sorrow to it, as if it too was waiting for someone who never came. How long was he meant to have been dead? Lewis shrugged in that precise way of his that meant he'd already asked and hadn't liked the answer. Official estimate was sometime the previous evening. Based on temperature and postural rigidity, I spared him the discomfort of quoting the Latin. So then, who had made the coffee? Who had set the music playing? Who had switched on the lights with such quiet deliberation that I, a man trained to notice the barely noticeable, had walked in and assumed the proprietor was in the loo? Lewis said there'd been a call. Anonymous. A woman, possibly, just after midnight. Said she thought something had happened at the Roasted Bean, but wouldn't say how she knew, wouldn't say much of anything, in fact. He passed me a folded sheet, the preliminary incident report. I read it without really reading. I'd been there scarcely 10 minutes before the body had been discovered, or so it seemed, which meant that whoever had adjusted the lights, cued the music, and prepared the espresso had done so after Hargrave's death, not before. And that was not the sort of thing one does on a whim. I thought again of the misquoted Eliot above the machine. In my end is my espresso. It still irritated me, but not just for the literary vandalism. It was the sort of deliberate misdirection that wanted to be noticed. Lewis asked if I thought it meant something. Everything means something, I said, without looking up. It's just a matter of whether it means what it wants you to think it means. I closed the Vaughan and stood, brushing a speck of dust from the sleeve of my coat that hadn't been there when I'd sat down. We walked out together, the soft murmur of scholars and scaffolding around us, and I found myself staring at the notice board beside the porter's desk. Nothing on it. Just the usual lectures and lost spectacles, but I stared anyway. Sometimes it's not what's pinned there that matters. Sometimes it's what's missing. I've always believed that a murder scene, if that's what it is, has its own grammar, its own punctuation, a kind of quiet syntax written not in words but in absences, misalignments, things left just a fraction off-center. The Roasted Bean had already begun to speak in that language. You only had to be willing to read slowly. By the time we returned, the place was shuttered, cordoned in that brittle, officious way meant to deter the curious. A strip of police tape fluttered like a weak pulse in the wind. The same Bach partita had ceased, mercifully, and the silence it left behind felt less like peace than aftermath. Lewis went ahead with the keys and the air of a man who still half thinks this is all a waste of morning breath. I let him. There's something about re-entering a place once the death has been acknowledged, like stepping back into a house after the funeral. Nothing has changed, but everything has shifted. The lights were off now, but the early gloom lent a muted fidelity to the layout. The counter, clean but hurriedly so. A table overturned in the far corner, as if someone had thought better of sitting. My eyes went, instinctively, to the register log by the till. Lewis reached it before I did, and thumbed it open with the care of a man afraid he might smudge the past. Last entry, J. Rook. No time stamp, just a scroll of looping over eager letters. The name caught, not in any practical sense. I knew no Rook, certainly no J, but in that half-lit part of the mind that deals in metaphor and memory. A rook. The bird, yes, but also the chess piece, straight-moving and black, a harbinger perhaps. Or a sacrifice. I recalled a crossword clue from some weeks ago. Dark-winged betrayer, 4 letters. I had thought crow at first, before realizing the answer was likely rook. In chess, the rook guards the king. Until it doesn't. Until it's lost in a feint or left to fall. I let Louis puzzle over the name while I moved behind the counter. The espresso machine sat as it had the day before. Dignified, heavy, a little vain. There was something ecclesiastical about it, as though it resented making lattes, but did so out of an inherited sense of duty. Beneath the till, half hidden behind a drawer of spoons, I found a key ring. Antique, brass, the sort one doesn't buy but inherits, or steals. 4 keys hung from it, one square-toothed, one modern, one too tiny for anything useful, and one missing. I held the ring up to the light. The metal was warm from its hiding place, as if the air hadn't quite accepted Hargrave was gone. Louis, meanwhile, had moved to the back. He called out something about the door. I joined him and saw it immediately. The back door, which opened onto a private alley shared with the tailoring shop, had a latch that had clearly been lifted recently, and with a hand more confident than careful. The screws were stripped, the wood surrounding them bruised, not forced open, not broken, but misaligned, as though someone had known how to enter quietly and had cared only enough to make it work once. Someone had left that way. Not a burglar, there was too much of value untouched, but someone who didn't want to be seen departing. Someone with a key, or with the kind of skill that renders keys unnecessary. We stood in that narrow passageway for a moment, the alley echoing faintly with the distant sound of church bells. Louis said something about the name in the register, whether I thought it was real. I said I didn't know. But it meant something. It always does, even if only to the person who wrote it. Back inside, I looked again at the misquoted Eliot. In my end is my espresso. The sentence still made no sense, which is, of course, precisely why it mattered. Grief, when rehearsed, has a particular cadence, a metronomic precision, as though the mourner has spent just enough time imagining this moment to render it unnatural. Margaret Hargrave spoke like that. She met us in a room lined with spine-cracked monographs and unlit candles, the kind of office that smells of Latin footnotes and watered violets. A small oil radiator ticked in the corner, valiantly failing against the cold. Her handshake was brief and bloodless. She offered us seats without the pretense of pleasantry, folded herself into a high-backed chair, and crossed her legs with a choreographed economy that made Louis, bless him, shift uncomfortably. I'd seen her once before, years ago, on the steps of the Bodleian, arguing gently but immovably with a priest about Augustine. I'd remembered her, not for her beauty, which was of the sharp, intellectual sort that insists on not being noticed, but for the way she used silence the way other people use adjectives. She said she was still Hargreaves' wife, technically. Legally, though in practice they'd parted with a great deal of civility several years earlier. He had kept the café, she had kept the house in Jericho, and they had kept each other's names out of conversation. There had been no animosity, she assured us, just fatigue. He hated coffee, she added, with a dry smile that didn't reach her voice. Couldn't bear the smell of it. Said it reminded him of burnt intentions. The contradiction was immediate, and not lost on Louis, who glanced at me. A man who despised coffee does not build his livelihood around the daily brewing of it, not without reason or guilt. She rose to retrieve the will from a locked drawer and handed it over with the smoothness of ritual. It had been amended, she explained, only 3 weeks prior. A short clause in Felix's angular script, witnessed and countersigned. Everything, the café, the flat above it, and what little remained in stocks and bonds, was to go to an unnamed individual, described only, curiously, as for services beyond loyalty, a peculiar phrase. Not devotion, not family, not love. Loyalty exceeded. I asked her who she thought that might refer to. She shrugged, with the faintest narrowing of the eyes, a gesture that left a long echo in the air. She claimed not to know. Said Felix had become secretive in his last years, reclusive, bordering on monastic. She assumed, perhaps, a former student or someone he employed briefly. Felix had a talent for drawing in strays, she said, and a worse one for disappointing them. I opened the folder and found that the solicitor's copy lacked something vital. The envelope that was meant to contain the name of the beneficiary. Margaret seemed neither surprised nor especially concerned, said the envelope must have been misplaced, or perhaps Felix never intended to name the person at all. A gesture rather than a transaction. She had a way of turning every ambiguity into something faintly philosophical. The solicitor, a pale, meticulous man, who spoke in subordinate clauses, confirmed the envelope had once existed. He had held it himself, he said, during the signing. A sealed envelope with Felix's initials across the flap. It was meant to remain untouched until after death, and now, of course, it had vanished. I asked Margaret when she had last seen it. She looked at me, evenly. The night before he died, she said. I'd brought papers for him to sign. He'd already prepared the envelope. I saw it on his desk beside a copy of La Vita Nuova. I remember because he had underlined a line in red. Love and the gentle heart are one and the same. She said it without irony. And for a moment I believed her. Or wanted to. Outside, the bell in St. Peter in the East began to chime. A soft, uncertain note that reminded me how time, too, has its own missing envelopes, and how rarely they remain sealed. It was a Thursday, though I remember it as a Wednesday. Some days do that. Slip their identity like a tired waiter switching aprons between shifts. The Eagle and Child was quieter than usual, the air thick with old wood smoke and the faint bitterness of dried hop. A boy behind the bar was polishing pint glasses with the distracted grace of someone composing lyrics in his head. We found Owen Bristow, exactly where I expected him. The far corner, beneath the half-yellowed portrait of Chesterton, 3 fingers into a glass of something that looked like memory. He raised his hand with the studied vagueness of a man pretending not to have seen us too soon. His tweed jacket, the same he'd worn in the early 80s, if I wasn't mistaken, bore the soft sheen of academic neglect. He used to lecture on romantic fragments and post-war despair. Now he mostly drank. Still, there was something about the curve of his vowels that made people lean in when he spoke, even when the words were without consequence. He said Felix had been a man who hated people but adored conversation. I asked him what that meant. He stirred his drink slowly. Said that Felix was the sort who would loathe your company, but hunger for your opinion, especially if it contradicted his own. That's why the roasted bean had suited him. A captive audience that changed daily and never stayed too long. I asked if he knew of anyone Felix had argued with lately. Bristow chuckled, said that would be like asking if the Bodleian housed books. But one name did surface, eventually. Julia Mortlock. There was a hesitation in how he said it, as though trying to place her in a filing cabinet that no longer quite opened. He described her as brilliant, precise, the sort of student who kept her own margins in better order than the lecture notes. Said there'd been a row, something to do with a letter, or possibly a coffee grinder. He couldn't remember which, only that it had happened in the final week of Michaelmas term. The name was familiar. Not in a way that drew up faces, but rather footnotes. Julia Mortlock. Yes. I remembered now, a lecture on medieval allegory, perhaps 5 years earlier. She had asked a question, not really a question, more a statement wrapped in a velvet glove, about betrayal in the Divine Comedy. Whether Dante's condemnation of Judas was theological or merely poetic, I'd answered something perfunctory at the time, but the phrasing of her inquiry had lingered. There was the weight of personal hurt behind it. That cool, scholarly ache that occasionally seeps through even the most carefully neutral voices. Bristow asked if she was in trouble. I said no. He nodded, as if that answer satisfied something unrelated. Said Julia had once spoken of Felix as if he were a door left half closed, inviting but never opened fully. That she'd helped in the café once during a summer break, but hadn't lasted. I asked him if Felix had spoken of her recently. He shrugged, only to say that she didn't finish things, that she left conversations the way other people leave umbrellas, quietly and always in the wrong place. He excused himself shortly after, muttering something about a tutorial he hadn't prepared for. I watched him leave, coat flapping like the tail end of a forgotten metaphor. Lewis said he didn't understand half of what Bristow had said. I told him that was the point. Some people speak in riddles not to conceal the truth, but because they've spent so long looking for it, they no longer trust it when it arrives. As we stepped back into the late afternoon mist, I found myself thinking of Julia Mortlock, and the strange way some names feel like doors before you even know what room they belong to. Some places preserve quiet, the way others preserve books. The Western Library, with its hallowed hush and cold geometry, is one such place. It resists intrusion, and in that, I've always admired it. Lewis had phoned that morning with the tone of someone who thought he was stating a footnote, but had in fact delivered a preface. Julia Mortlock, our former barista, half-forgotten student, and occasional Dantean provocateur, now found herself amidst folios and marginalia, cataloguing rare texts like a woman filing the past into manageable boxes. I didn't call ahead. Some doors open better when knocked upon unannounced. The assistant at reception pointed me toward the second-floor mezzanine, where the light filtered down in long, respectful shafts, and even the floors seemed to walk more carefully than usual. Julia was exactly as I remembered, though more so. Tall, not in height, but in bearing. Hair the color of old paper, and eyes that didn't quite settle on you unless they wanted to. Her office was no more than a cubicle lined in glass, a desk strewn with index cards, annotations, and one rather battered kettle that looked perpetually undecided. She didn't look surprised to see me. Amused, perhaps, the faint uptick of one eyebrow like the opening chord of a Shostakovich quartet. "Inspector," she said, without rising. "I wondered when you'd make your way up the staircase." I told her it was an excellent staircase. She smiled politely, then gestured toward a chair that hadn't been offered but was somehow already there. We spoke of Felix. I said we'd heard she'd worked with him once. She nodded, lips tight in that way people use when pretending their opinion has been mislaid somewhere behind civility. Said it had been a summer job, nothing more, that the wages were poor, the coffee excellent, and the temperament of the owner peculiar, a word she laced with just enough acidity to preserve the illusion of impartiality. "Felix," she said, "was the sort of man who remembered your failings in alphabetical order. And yet," I said, "you stayed for nearly 3 months." "I was younger," she replied. And he had a way of making even insults sound like compliments mispronounced. She offered nothing more, and I knew better than to ask directly. It was while she answered, or perhaps avoided answering a question about the last time she'd seen him, that I noticed her hand, not in motion but in rhythm. She was turning the handle of a small coffee grinder, absent-mindedly, without urgency, like a pianist warming up a forgotten scale. It was the same model as the one in Hargrave's café. I recognized the patina, the shallow nick near the base, the varnish worn down by fingers. She caught my glance. "Coincidence," she said, before I had even spoken. "I collect them. Coffee grinders. There's something unpretentiously honest about their design." I asked how many she had. "Just the one," she said, her voice too level. I nodded, not out of belief but to preserve the air of conversation. On her desk lay a copy of 4 quartets, the Faber edition. It was open, spine cracked and underlined in several colors. The quote, "In my end is my beginning," sat in its proper place. "You like Eliot?" I asked. She looked up sharply. "I like precision," she said. I rose then, asked if she would be available should further questions arise. She said she always was, especially when she didn't want to be. As I walked back down the staircase, "Yes, an excellent one." I couldn't quite shake the image of her hand on the grinder. That slow, indifferent rotation of gesture can be a memory, or a habit, or a confession spoken without grammar. And silence, as always, speaks in present tense. The report arrived folded twice, in an envelope that had already begun to curl at the edges. Lewis handed it over without ceremony, as though hoping the paper might speak more clearly than he could. It didn't. Toxicology, it seemed, had decided to leave its conclusions in ellipses. No outright cause of death, no immediate toxins, but a footnote, quiet, but insistent, mentioned a trace compound, potassium benzoate, a common preservative in sweetened syrups, vanilla, hazelnut, the sort of flavorings cafes keep hidden behind silver pumps and cheerful blackboards. Felix Hargrave had an allergy to it, severe, documented, rare, yes, but not fictional. Enough to narrow the airways, said the report, with a forensic neutrality that bordered on cruel, enough to kill. Except the roasted bean, according to its own signage and Felix's obsessive palate, used none of that syrupy frivolity. No sweeteners, no syrups, no cinnamon sprinkles, for those who wanted coffee to taste less like regret. Just the beans, the machine, and the man. We returned to the café, its silence more pronounced now, as though it had decided to let grief settle into its fixtures. The back room was tighter than I remembered. An angled sliver of space between the boiler and the storage shelves, filled with the kind of detritus you only notice when someone's life has been dismantled. Cleaning cloths, folded with care, a box of unopened paper cups, a single rubber glove, unpaired. Behind the vintage La Pavoni machine, older than Hargrave's marriage, I'd have wagered, I found a bottle, dark glass, unlabeled. The adhesive stain on the side suggested the label had once existed, removed recently. Cleanly. The cap still smelled faintly of artificial vanilla. Louis held it in his hand, frowning. Said nothing, but tilted it slightly, so the light caught the sediment at the base. I watched it settle. I turned my attention to the delivery ledger, a thick, stained volume that bore the marks of years rather than months. Ink that had faded at the corners, numbers with the guarded neatness of someone who distrusted accounting but did it anyway. There were entries on dates when the cafe was closed. Mondays, mostly. Hargrave had always observed a sort of secular Sabbath. The cafe shut tight while the rest of Oxford staggered into the week, and yet 3 Mondays in the past 2 months bore entries, deliveries from a company I didn't recognize, Orbis Trading. No address, no contact. Just the name, circled faintly in red. Odd, I said aloud. Louis looked up. You don't circle your own notes, I said. You underline. You double mark. But a circle, that's what people do when they want to remind themselves to question something. He nodded, though I'm not sure he saw the distinction. As I closed the ledger, something slipped from between the pages. A photograph curled at the corners, faintly yellowed, as if it had been kept there for memory rather than record. A young man, Felix, unmistakably, dark-haired, unsmiling in that performative way people once thought made them look important. Beside him, a woman. It could have been Margaret. The jawline was similar. It could have been Julia. The mouth, perhaps, though age distorts. Or it could have been someone else entirely. Someone neither of us recognized. She was turned slightly toward him, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve, in that way that speaks of either affection or possession. Her eyes, though, her eyes were looking somewhere else entirely. I handed it to Louis. Do you think that's Margaret? He asked. I said nothing. Some photographs aren't meant to be identified, only understood. The light outside had begun to fail. The smell of stale espresso lingered, touched now with something darker. Not decay. Not yet, but the first stirrings of truth, perhaps. And like coffee, it is always strongest just before it cools. For a time all the arrows pointed one way toward Julia Mortlock, walking through her well-chosen words like a woman navigating an elegant trap she herself had designed. There was something too finely balanced in her indifference, too rehearsed in the way she spoke of Felix Hargrave, as if he were no more than a poorly footnoted memory. She had the motive, or rather, a trio of them, the bitterness of unpaid wages, the tangled intimacy of academic betrayal, and now, the faint scent of a lost inheritance drifting like steam above a forgotten will. Her name didn't appear in any of the legal documents, but neither did the intended heir. That was the point. Even her books conspired against her. Every quotation bore the texture of something sharpened, not to dazzle but to wound. Eliot, Dante, even Donne, all turned subtly against the dead. Lewis, for his part, had grown quietly convinced, said it fit. Said he could see her walking in that morning, knowing his allergy, slipping a touch of syrup into the creamer, letting the espresso do the rest. No break-in required, no evidence needed, just a single exact betrayal. But nothing felt right. A case, like music, needs more than precision. It needs cadence. And something in Julia's story sounded a semitone off. Not false, just unresolved, like a cord suspended too long in the air. I was holding the photograph again when the call came. Chief Superintendent Strange. With his usual diplomacy, he asked, in the way one does when pretending not to be angry, why I was still spending my time, and more importantly, the department's, on what was clearly an obvious natural death. The man was in his 60s. He ran a business alone. It was November, and people died in November all the time. I said nothing for a long moment. Then I hung up. The photograph lay beneath the desk lamp, edges now soft from too much handling. Felix, younger, slightly off-center, as though he'd already begun trying to edge out of his own story. And beside him, not Julia. Of course not. I'd known it, somewhere underneath the convenience of misrecognition. It was Margaret, sharper featured then, but unmistakable. The same mouth that hesitated between scorn and serenity, the same distance in the eyes. But most of all, she was pregnant. The fullness wasn't quite obvious, not if you weren't looking, but I was. The next morning I returned to her cottage in Jericho. She opened the door with the stillness of someone who'd already rehearsed what she wouldn't say. I showed her the photograph without preamble. She looked long enough. Then she spoke. He never acknowledged her, she said. Either of us. She didn't cry. That would have been too simple, too clarifying. Instead, she sat, as if the words had loosened something in her knees. She told me, in clipped phrases, that Felix had insisted they tell no one, that it would complicate things, his work, his reputation, his already uncertain finances, that she'd agreed, because what else could she do? You cannot reason with a man who only trusts you in private. She spoke of a daughter, not by name, just as her, as though naming might grant too much permanence. I asked if the daughter knew about the will. She shook her head, no. And it had to stay that way. The envelope, she said, had gone missing. Or maybe she had taken it. Or maybe she had. Some confessions, when uttered, change nothing. They are like turning over a card to find not the queen you feared, but a blank face, still unreadable. I left without pressing further. The rain had started again, softly, rushing the rooftops, like someone trying not to wake the past. And behind me Margaret stood in the doorway of her narrow cottage, arms folded against the chill, staring not at me but at something I would never see. It was Lewis, as so often, who found the stone worth turning. Not by design, not exactly, just a glance at a tenancy record, a cross-reference with a utilities bill, and then quite unceremoniously, the name Joseph Rook, a man who had, until 18 months prior, shared a landing with Julia Mortlock in a narrow block just off Cowley Road. Rook. The name rang no immediate bell, but there was something unnerving about its very symmetry. The kind of name you forget until it glances back at you from a chessboard, one square removed from consequence. He was easy to find. The archivist's desk at the Ashmolean, cluttered with the minor devotions of someone who spent his days alphabetizing fragments of other people's legacies. When I arrived, he was halfway through labeling a drawer of misfiled correspondence, the faded ink already giving way to time. I introduced myself. He stood too quickly, knocking a sheaf of carbon copies to the floor. When he bent to retrieve them, I noticed the tremor in his hand, not dramatic, but habitual, the tremor of someone who had spent a life trying to remain unremarked. He insisted on making tea. It took 20 minutes. I let him fill the time with apologies and procedural asides, all delivered with the slightly frantic courtesy of the chronically overlooked. When I asked about Felix Hargrave, the reaction was not anger, not even bitterness. It was fear. He blinked once, swallowed, said softly, "I only ever went there for coffee." I said nothing. He added, after a pause, that it was the only place that used a certain kind of roast, Indonesian, dark, with a savory edge, that it reminded him of something. He didn't say what. I asked him, eventually, why he'd signed the customer register as J.C. Rook, a name he hadn't used according to public record in over a decade. This time he didn't blink. He stopped entirely. The silence was of the sort that builds slowly, like fog, because that's how he knew me. He said, "Who?" "Felix." The word landed like a match dropped in water, a spark extinguished before it reached anything flammable. He told me, not fluently, but in the stop-start rhythms of someone unaccustomed to telling anything at all, that Felix Hargrave had once read his novel, not in print, not in review, but from a manuscript, submitted long ago for an ill-fated fellowship, a novel that had never been published, but phrases had lived on, metaphors, a line of poetry, misquoted and rearranged. Even the idea for a character, a barista who understood people by the way they stirred their coffee, Felix had borrowed liberally, quietly, artfully, and Rook had watched, not confronted, not accused, just watched, for years, as his ideas were passed off as someone else's melancholy. He never published again. Couldn't. Said it would seem like the theft had always belonged to him. The café, he said, had become a kind of shrine to that, to everything stolen and dressed as introspection. I asked him what he'd wanted that day. He stared at his teacup, as though divination might offer a better answer. I only wanted him to read what he ruined, he said. Then he reached, almost absently, for a small folder on his desk. Inside, pages, typed and annotated. A draft, perhaps, maybe the one Felix had read. On the title page, "The Waste Keepers." I looked at the first epigraph. "In my beginning is my end." At last, the Eliot quote was correct, and yet nothing, still, was quite resolved. I thanked him. He didn't rise, just nodded once, as though the conversation had already happened a long time ago, and this was merely the echo. Outside, the sky hung low and undecided. The wind carried the scent of burnt beans, or perhaps it was just memory. There was one chapter left, and it wasn't in any novel. It had been folded without care, the kind of fold one makes when trying to forget something. Not preserve it. A corner, torn. A small blot, near the bottom margin. Julia had passed it to me 3 days earlier, almost lazily, with the vague air of someone handing over a menu from a café she no longer frequented. Said it was something Felix once scribbled, or stole. She couldn't remember which. At the time, I'd skimmed it and found little of use. A semi-poetic draft, fragmentary and inconsistent. The kind of literary detritus left behind by a man who had never quite decided whether he was a barista or a bard. I'd meant to throw it away. Had nearly done so, and yet it had found its way into my coat pocket, then to the edge of my desk, then beneath a volume of Browning I hadn't opened in years. It was there I found it again, the rain dragging itself softly down my windows like a memory refusing to leave quietly. I read it this time, not for content, but for shape. It didn't scan properly. That had bothered me. A stanza of 6 lines, then 4, then 5, irregular, but not carelessly so. Felix was many things, but he understood form. Even his thefts had structure. And then I saw it. The second stanza. 4 lines, simple enough. But the first letters vertically spelled it out without flourish. Tes, E, Lil, O. I stopped. The third stanza. E, D, A, O, her, a beat. Then the last line on its own. Her. He lied about her. I didn't move for some time. I reached for the phone and rang Lewis, who answered with the sort of exhaustion only paperwork can instill. "I need Hargrave's private notebooks," I said, "the ones from the back room." And Lewis, not the inventories, the ones with the stain. He didn't ask why. 2 hours later, they were on my desk, spiral-bound, soft-covered, reeking faintly of old milk and bergamot. Between pages of rambling notes, blend percentages, mock lyrical musings on creamer, an unfinished sonnet to the art of steaming, I found what I was looking for. The same handwriting, the same stanza, half copied, and beneath it a name. No surname, just Ellie. Not Margaret, not Julia. A daughter, born in secrecy, hidden, even from the people who thought they knew Felix best. Not out of shame, but because, as he wrote in one muddied line, some loves cannot be declared without consequence. The addendum to the will had named her. And someone who knew, had removed it. Not for money. Not quite. But for silence. For a story rewritten. Just slightly. Felix had brewed his last cup. That much remained certain. What wasn't, until now, was the precise order of events. The coffee had been made with deliberation, the grinder cleaned, the milk frothed to that barely audible sigh he insisted upon. And then, before the shop opened, someone had added just a touch of syrup, enough to kill, slowly, enough to let the heat disguise the sabotage. No struggle, no evidence. Just a man with a known allergy and a cup of his own design. Who? Perhaps Margaret. Or someone for whom she had once suffered enough to justify it. Perhaps even Elise herself. In some quiet rebellion against being hidden too long. But I no longer wanted the answer. Not precisely. There is a kind of justice in leaving certain endings unfinished, especially when they concern daughters unacknowledged and women made to disappear in the margins of stronger men's stories. The will would be contested. The truth might surface, or not, but the café would close, the scent of beans fading into the cold dampness of Oxford's air. I sat back, poured a whiskey, listened to a recording of Fisher playing Bach, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't reach for a crossword. There was nothing left to decode, just a letter, reread, and the faint suggestion of a line not quite spoken. Some truths are never written down. They're only brewed, slowly, bitterly, once, and then gone. The rain had tapered to mist by the time I reached the cottage again. Not the pleasant kind, soft and literary, but a gray that seeps into sleeves and books and mood. The lane was half drowned in sycamore leaves, slick and rust-colored, like pages torn from an autumn that had decided not to end. Margaret Hargrave answered before I knocked. She must have seen me through the lace curtain, or perhaps she had simply known I'd come. She didn't speak, only stepped aside, her dressing gown drawn tight around her like a coat of arms too threadbare to defend anything now. Inside, the hearth had gone cold. A mug sat on the windowsill, untouched, the tea inside congealing at the edges. She sat in the same chair as before, but her posture had changed. No longer composed, just resigned. I said her name. She looked at me. Not with fear, not quite, a kind of relief, almost. As if the weight she carried was one she'd long grown tired of balancing. She spoke without prompting. I never meant to kill him, she said. The words were flat, not confessional but mechanical, like a phrase she'd practiced silently across sleepless nights. Just a little syrup, she said. Enough to make him feel strange, delay things. I thought perhaps it would unsettle him enough to forget the solicitor that week, enough to buy time. She smoothed a thread on her lap that wasn't there. He always said good coffee should be fast and strong. There was bitterness in her voice, but it was old bitterness, the kind that had lost its sharpness and now tasted only of ash. He drank it too quickly, she added. I didn't know he'd drink it that quickly. I said nothing. The silence became a third presence in the room. It held more than either of us. She went on, softer now. He was ashamed, you know. Not just of Elise, of me, of everything we were after. The Oxford dinner stopped. After the talking stopped, he liked being admired, not needed. And I need. She paused. The will. I took it before they could read it. He'd left everything to her, to our daughter, and I couldn't let her carry that. Not publicly, not in courtrooms and probate offices. He never claimed her when it mattered. It would shame her now. I looked at her, really looked. The lines at the corners of her mouth, not from laughter but restraint. The young woman I'd glimpsed in the photograph, now wrapped in the kind of age that comes not from years but from disappointment, day after day. It wasn't murder, not entirely, but it was enough. I rose. She didn't follow. At the threshold, I turned back once, and she met my eyes, not pleading, just waiting. Outside, Louis stood beside the car, collar turned up against the mist. He looked at me with that cautious expectancy he's never quite shed, as though one day I might surprise him by doing something loudly or decisively. "Well?" he asked. She admitted it. He exhaled. The kind of breath that carries paperwork in its folds. "You could arrest her," he said. I looked past him toward the trees dissolving into fog. "Or," I said, "I could simply let Oxford forget." He said nothing, just nodded, barely, and opened the door on the passenger side. As we pulled away, the cottage sank back into itself, a shape in the rain, indistinct and unremarkable. No headlines would follow, no trials, just a café that had closed, a will that would remain contested, and a daughter who would never quite know what her mother had spared her. Some things don't require justice, only silence, and Oxford has always excelled at silence. The boards had gone up quickly, pine slats over the windows, a rusted chain threaded through the handles of the door, as though the city were trying to forget the roasted bean with the same haste it used to forget its minor tragedies. No placard, no farewell, just a vacant shopfront now dressed for forgetting. The rain had returned, not with drama, but with a kind of weary persistence. It softened the edges of everything. Even the graffiti on the alley wall had begun to melt into an impressionist blur. I stood beneath the narrow awning one last time, just as I had on the morning this all began, though the awning now sagged with collected water, and the scent of coffee no longer escaped from inside. It was strange how a place could unmake itself. The absence felt deliberate, as if the very building was embarrassed by its recent history. I walked without intention, letting the city gather around me in its usual wet hush, past the empty quad of Brasenose, where a gardener trimmed a hedge with the kind of focus reserved for grief, past a group of students beneath umbrellas, arguing, I assumed, about Plato or rent. Eventually I found my way to the bench near the Radcliffe camera. I'd sat there many times. It is not particularly comfortable. Damp stone and a slight tilt, but the view has its own kind of grammar. The curve of the camera, the slope of Catter Street, the ever-turning wheel of Oxford's private silences. I opened the crossword. A small mercy, really, that the Times still arrived on time despite everything else that no longer did. The clues were pedestrian, until the last. Bitterness, with memory, stirred. I stared at it for a while. My pen hovered, then withdrew. There was no need to write it down. I knew the answer, of course. Regret, 5 letters. Bitterness, certainly. And the anagram, memory, stirred, only served to heighten the irony. I smiled, faintly, not with pleasure. Some clues resolved themselves too cleanly. Others remained blurred at the corners, half answered, half understood. Margaret's confession had not surprised me, nor had her restraint. There was something almost classical in it, really. The delay, the poison, the guilt shaded with purpose. Julia's silence, too, had the flavor of old Greek plays. The woman who watches, who witnesses, but declines to act. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. She had quoted Dante, not for menace but for accuracy. And Rock, Joseph Rock, whose name had never graced a spine, whose words had been stolen and brewed and sold over a polished counter. He would continue to haunt libraries in footnotes and first drafts, known only by the theft, not the original thought. Oxford did that. Polished some, undid others. No city wears its tragedies so quietly. I folded the crossword and slipped it into my coat pocket, where it would join other unfinished things. Behind me, Someone passed with a takeaway cup, the scent of coffee trailing behind, thin and insufficient. It mingled with the rain, with the smell of wet leaves and old stone, and something that felt like the end of October. The bench was colder now. I stood. There was nothing left to investigate, no formal charges to file. Only a woman alone in a cottage, a daughter spared the shame of legacy, and a death that had been in the end more accident than murder, though no less bitter for it. The kind of ending one doesn't write down. I walked on, past the Bodleian's closed doors, down the slight incline toward Broad Street. The rain had begun to settle, not as a storm but as a presence, a steady rhythm against the cobbles, familiar, undeniable, and somewhere behind me, beneath the boarded shop and the darkened sign, a cup sat untouched, left cooling, and no one, not even Oxford, could warm it again.